already put so many labor reforms. Qatar already finished so many like construction projects, and that's why we think that it's time for them to expand the labor rights, and they can invite Western countries, our companies to prosper more. So I'm gonna do three things. First, explaining the context. Secondly, why this policy is going to work, and thirdly, why it's so good for Qatar. So first, the context. So the first thing to talk about here is that the geopolitical context. Like there are Saudi Arabia, like Bahrain or Oman, those like Gulf countries are attempting to become the tourist hubs or like financial center of those those areas like Singapore. Meaning that Saudi Arabia, for example, constructing Neon City on the desert, or the other countries who are trying to improve the reputation in those things. That's why they are trying to invite, for example, sports games. I think that's why Qatar invited like FIFA World Cup, for example. They are trying to create resorts or airports, those kind of things. The implication here is that there's a glamorization effect exists, which means that only one region or only one place can be the center or can be the heart of the economy. Why? Because companies put offices in one place in order to deal with the businesses around that region, like the Middle East or North Africa, those things. Meaning that also like other countries are reluctant to put like the labor rights to those workers, right? Because poor workers are get used to poor condition of the labor reforms, and other employers are also getting used to such situation, which means that being the first country to protect labor rights is a significant and tipping point of pulling Western companies, like the more like the developed Western companies, for example, law and financial companies or other service companies. Meaning that it's very difficult for those Western companies to put like their offices in the areas where like the labor, like the rights are not guaranteed, because of the fact that the reputation is a very significant, factor for those companies to get the significant loss in their profit. The second thing to talk about here in the context is that the Qatar. So Qatar already puts labor reforms, so many things, against the scandal of the labor rights in the Qatar FIFA World Cup. We think that they are using, for example, A, like healthy standards, B, like the setting minimum wage, or C, prohibition of holding a passport, for example, those kind of things. We believe that it's the further interest for Qatar to add paid parental leave, or more anti-discrimination laws, or raise minimum wage, those things. We think that makes the Qatar's economy or labor the conditions more durable, more competitive to other Western states. So second part, why it's going to work, and I have 4 reasons here. First is that the Qatar doesn't engage in resource extraction anymore, right? Because of the fact that Qatar is very small, it's very difficult to to live with extracting resources inside the region, and also because of the climate change, it's very difficult for them to extract resources anymore. And second reason here is that the large construction projects are being completed in the current situation, as I pointed out, which means that there's less and less demand for the construction workers. But third is that among Gulf countries, I think Qatar is relatively famous because of the FIFA World Cup or other Al Jazeera or those developed the media. I think that's why the Qatar is in a good position to these improving labor rights and attracting those Western countries. The fourth thing is that Qatar is relatively liberal when compared to Saudi Arabia, and also they are politically stable in the current situation. For those reasons, I think Qatar is in a good place to implement such policies. But also, secondly, we think that demand for financial center from the Western companies is very big now, because A, there are less alternatives. For example, like the Brexit. Because of the Brexit, the United Kingdom is becoming the less and less significant for those the economic companies to make it as economic center, or also trouble the conflicts or increasing tension in the Southeast Asia, for example, because of the Taiwan Strait. Because of those things, the companies are more reluctant to put their economic center at for example, Singapore, because of the fact that there might be some tension and conflict in the future. But also, secondly, U.S. is becoming unpopular because of the opposition against China, right? They are putting the sanction, they are competing with China. That's why it's very difficult for companies to run the business in China, for example, if you put the offices in the U.S. Or B, there's a political instability in the U.S. The internal politics here. But also we think that the lots of businesses chances are happening in the Middle East or North Africa, which is located near near Qatar. And that's why it's the appetite for those Western companies to put in place those offices at the new location of A, low tax as Qatar has, B, politically stable, and C, not subjected to geopolitical risk as I explained beforehand. So lastly, why it's so valuable for Qatar to have these Western companies. First is that the Middle Eastern companies have understanding of principle of we won't tax you, instead you don't have representation, right? What they do now is that the Qatar is creating so many public jobs instead with the low the tax, but because instead the workers don't really have the representation in the politics. But the current situation here is that the government's budget is drying because they cannot extract resources, as I explained it beforehand. And also people's stress is increasing because they're because of the poor the public jobs of the Qatar, they are those jobs are becoming more and more boring and more the bureaucratic. I mean in that situation, introducing or inviting financial sector firms or white collar firms or service firms who are likely to come into Qatar by this policy. I mean that those when those companies come in, those companies would be run by the Western experts. Maybe the executives would be people from other Western countries. But I think that the employees in those offices are predominantly local people, right? Which means that the impact here is not big. There's less spent on public jobs. They don't really have to care about the loss of jobs on local people. That's why they can cut the cost of creating public jobs. The B is that the less demand of representation. Now people are calling representation because the job they have is not so the quality is not so good, even though they are rich, which means that by having more interesting, also exciting, diverse jobs in Qatar, which means that they will satisfy with the status quo where people have low taxation but also no representation, which creates the further political stability in Qatar, which means that the more and more Western companies are more likely to come into the Qatar. The way here is that meaning that Western workers, as I already explained, Western workers or Western companies are attracted to the companies where people have substantial labor rights because of the fact that the companies care about their reputation, and also many Western people are basically get used to the condition where the paid leave system exists or there is the protection on the labor exists, right? Meaning that by preparing the same condition in the Qatar, they're more likely to have the companies and also workers who can provide jobs to the locals and who can provide political stability. I'm very proud to propose.
First question I'm going to ask in this speech is where do these reforms take place? In which industries? Because both sides will probably give you some form of plausible metric. They say it takes place in the service industries that face Westerners. We say it takes place in the oil industries and construction industries that are a very real part of your economy. The reason you're going to end up buying side negatives characterization is because we are going to give you a set of, I think there's 6 structural reasons to explain why those are the areas where this debate takes place, why that characterization was the one you should believe. Firstly, I'm going to explain this. I'm going to explain this in 2 ways. Firstly, I'm going to give you 4 reasons why those areas where they talk about service industries facing Westerners, FIFA World Cup, the reforms have already taken place. That is where you have nice conditions for workers. Why? 4 reasons. Firstly, because simply the people that come into your country tend to be racist. They tend to want white workers to service them. That means you're not getting the migrant labor that services our industries like oil. It is things like you're bringing in people from the Western countries rather than India and Pakistan that make up the most of your migrant labor that you do exploit. Secondly, because these areas are consumer facing, which means there's already direct pressure on them to try and reform. That is why there are good labor standards there currently. Thirdly, because there is clear capital requirements in these areas to look good, because you want to bring in capital into things like the FIFA World Cup, as you explained. But fourthly, because you can be selective. which means that Qatar has the power to have decent regulations for one area, that is the area of the Western Sea. We have the ability to have worse ones elsewhere. Those worst ones are in economic industries like oil, in your far out drilling platforms, in your construction sites. Those are the areas where exploitation occurs. Therefore, it must be the areas where reforms would be significant, and thus this debate takes place. But secondly, on oil, they suggest that oil is likely to go away. Three things to note. Firstly, simply sense check this. Just because the news media has talked about FIFA lately does not mean that Qatar has stopped producing oil. Obviously, it's a huge part of its economy. You know that. Secondly, their first push as to why this is the case is that Qatar is geographically small, so cannot have much oil. I would note Kuwait makes up like 1/5 of the world's oil supply and is so small it can be like the 19th province of Iraq. Obviously, small countries can have a ton of oil because oil can be under a country they're often very dense. But secondly, they say climate change. Two things to note about climate change. Firstly, simply means there is more demand for oil because you have more economic crises, you have more things like countries going unstable, you need backups of oil. But secondly, I would note that insofar as they need to respond to climate change, there's a strategy which we will explain, which requires the capital flow. Okay, what do you know at the end of that? The vast majority of places this debate takes place is the oil industry, it is construction sectors. Don't let them run away by talking about service. With that in mind, three things I want to do. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, why explaining why it absolutely tanks your economy. Finally, where you are able to sustain this into the long term. Firstly, on setup, I want to know a couple of things. Firstly, politically, it is obviously not a democratic state. It is controlled by oligarchies and powerful economic peoples, which means you have no backlash to bad economics, bad labour regulations internally. Workers have no rights. Secondly, on economics, I would note they export oil as their main export, do a bit of construction as well, that both industries are reliant on cheap labour. They're reliant on people that come in from Sri Lanka or Pakistan or India. That requires migrants, that requires it to be cheap. But the second thing to note is that Qatar has a long-term plan to diversify in the ways they want. What does that look like? It looks like sell oil at a really cheap, competitive rate to make a current account surplus. Turn that current account surplus of US dollars into a public investment fund. And take that public investment fund and do it to do things like lure in Western tech companies to set up IT hubs. That is the plan. That requires capital. Thirdly, on foreign policy, the thing to note in setup here is twofold. Firstly, obviously it's not accountable foreign policy for the reason that A, it requires no Western aid, the main method through which they enforce things. Secondly, it is obviously competitive, which means it has to, Western companies still need to buy its oil if it is competitive. Thirdly, it has the public investment fund based on things like a current account surplus, which allows it to do things like pull in diplomatic capital by donating to countries like Switzerland when they bail out Credit Suisse. Final thing to note on foreign policy is obviously there is also a strategic competition with the other Gulf Cooperation Council states, as they talk about, but note that competition is economic too, because those states do have this model. They do have cheap labour. They do subject their workers to bad rights, which means they are your competition. We must compete with them in order to survive. Okay, with that in mind, first point, explaining why this absolutely tanks your economy. This point's going to explain why you need cheap labour to survive. If you do not, you just fall apart. First thing to note is that those industries rely on low income, cheap, bad regulations and cheap labour, and that is a problem that cannot be fixed. Two parts to this. Firstly, labour must be cheap. For the reason that A, you're in direct competition with other countries that do this, like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE. That means you must compete with them to keep your margins low. Secondly, there are low economies of scale and low forms of mechanization in Qatar, for the reason that you often have to move your oil drilling sites. If you want to keep constructing or keep drilling, you must go to different parts of the country once one dries up or one construction project is finished. But thirdly, it's really hard to mechanize the Qatar economy. Note they kind of hand wave how they actually do this. Obviously, you would have to import things like mechanistic goods. Those things are not produced locally. They're not even produced regionally. They're produced in faraway countries like India or America, which means you have to import them. That's very expensive. Second thing to note is that unsafe labor is a core part of the process for two reasons. Firstly, it's inherent to the kinds of work you do. Because oil and construction are inherently dangerous activities, note that people die in oil and construction all the time in the West. But secondly, because there are things which is very hard to make them safe cheaply. Because A, it is simply hard to mechanize them, as I've already explained. But B, you have to hire a bunch of high-ranking supervisors with organizational skills. That is a lot of money investing in HR. And thirdly, you must buy safety gear, which again is just incredibly expensive. What do you know at the end of that? That explains why when you raise the cost of labor, your economy is going to tank. Three ways. Firstly, you diminish your margins. You are no longer as able to produce as cheaply. You're no longer able to build things as quickly or as cheaply because you have to spend time on things like higher labor costs, things like safety. That means things like the current account surplus and the public investment fund that buy you diplomatic capital and allow you to diversify do not work. Secondly, you lose your competitive advantage. You cannot compete with other countries. Thirdly, it becomes very difficult to move operations like construction or mining from one part of the country to the other. 4 reasons. Firstly, it is hard to force workers to move when they have lots of rights. You cannot kick them out of their homes and move them somewhere else. Secondly, your economy becomes more sticky by the point where you've done things like mechanize, where you have put a bunch of mechanical things in the ground there. It is hard to move that oil place elsewhere. Thirdly, you need to retrain a bunch of people. What that explains is it is very difficult to move from one area of the country to another, though that is necessary to survive at the point where your economy is reliant on drilling up the last bits of oil everywhere in the country so that you can diversify as fast as possible. That kind of money requires you moving from one area to another. You can only do that when you can force the workers to move, when you have the ability to make them incredibly low industrialized, so that once you move the workers, you don't need to move machines. That is what allows you to survive. That is what gets you the money that you can put in your funds to lure in Western tech companies so that when they do run out of oil, they will be able to survive in the long term. Final thing I want to note is that it's a sustainable system over time. What I want to do firstly here is explain that most of their pushes about like service industries, even if you buy that characterization, simply are symmetric. The reason that a bunch of the reasons they explain that Qatar is attractive still exist. It still has low tax rates. In fact, I suggest you probably get more low tax rates when you have a bunch of current account surplus from selling oil really cheaply. That shit means you can afford to give Western countries tax breaks. But secondly, you can simply treat the workers facing those industries well and keep the rest of your population subjugated. That is what they do. That works. That still allows Qatar to survive. Second thing to note on construction, they say that construction has dried up. 2 responses. Firstly, as I explained, you must continue constructing in different areas to do things like develop your economy, to do things like develop oil in a bunch of different areas in your country. But secondly, I would suggest that a prerequisite to accessing business is to construct things. Qatar has a couple major cities. If you want to become a huge tourist destination, A, you need to upload those cities massively, but B, you need to develop areas to ways to access more of the country. You need to do all sorts of infrastructure like roads and airports. Construction is clearly continuing. Final thing to note about it being sustainable over time, obviously A, your workforce is sustainable because they have migrant labour from places like India, Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Vast numbers of them. India gets $100 billion from remittances. Huge number of people, you're not running out of them. But secondly, there are deep problems with this. For example, the instability in India is getting worse. Climate change in India is getting worse. Places like Jalalabad in Pakistan are above the livable temperature. That means migrant workers always come. There are always enough of them that they're competing down to the bottom prices. You always have these people. Your general population, you can just give state jobs for the 10% of them, you give them cushy jobs. At the end of this, what do you know? This debate takes place in oil and construction. In those sectors, you can just cheat off the service industries. You're able to survive by diversifying long term. That's what side negative gets you. So proud to oppose.
Very clear imperative at first, and that is to say that Qatar has benefited from oil, it has benefited this wealth, but this is a source of wealth that is drying up, that it is no longer as competitive as it may have been in the region, that there are other countries that just can do it better than it, and that the area where it is competitive, and the one that it needs to turn to immediately, is in attempting to become a financial and services hub, is in getting investment, and is in getting Western and international firms to move to that region. And we are the side that gives you that, because we are the side that heals the reputation of Qatar as a state that is one that is against human rights abuses. We are a state that means that people from the West are happy to move here because they are sure that they can have parental leave when they have a child, that they will be paid enough, that they are not supporting a country that is abusing its oil and mining sector workers. They are happy to live there. We give you that imperative. We engage with Qatar far, far better into the long term. We take the debate. Firstly, I'm going to engage on oil and construction. Talk about why I do not think this is where the debate operates, and why that cannot win them the debate, and they have to engage more clearly on the stuff that I will then rehash about why this is so effective in getting international investment and why that is a debate-winning benefit. On oil and construction, basically they say here we can be really picky and have really bad labour standards in oil and construction industries compared to in other areas. A few responses, and I think a lot of these come up first and are pretty mentally responded to at first negative. That is to say that they agree that diversification is really, really critical in for now, that Qatar has built a lot of wealth and reputation off of oil, that it is in the second stage of the plan that they recognise Qatar needs to repeat. As in, yes, maybe 5 years ago Qatar needed to do more oil investment and more of that. By now I think that it has gotten there. And that is just very simply that Qatar is not nearly as competitive on oil as it could be in other sectors. That is because there are other Gulf states, places like Saudi Arabia, places like what they tell you about where there's just incredibly concentrated amounts of oil that are able to do things like just have bigger economies of scale, extract more oil, do the things like having bad human rights, bad labour policies, even better than Qatar, because notably Qatar recently has gone through massive backlash against things like human rights, is trying to appeal as a more Western state, and that means that Saudi Arabia can just always pay its workers less. It can tap into those migrant worker sources more so and take those away from them, but sit on this metric, and there are, as well as other factors like things like climate change, meaning that this industry is just less important into the long term, and that we do need to diversify, and we do need to diversify now. But additionally, we bring you something else that we think is specific to Qatar, and that is the fact that Qatar, as a city-state, has a lot of people who work in the public sector and in management, and these people are hated because they, basically trade off paying tax for being given these, pretty well-paid management jobs. But the issue is the government just doesn't have the money or the funding to continue to pay these individuals because of things like the fact that oil is no longer as profitable as it once was for this day, because they have a city that is mostly constructed, and so they just don't need to do as much construction as they maybe once did. And that means that this is a group that is powerful, a group that does threaten the government of this country, because when they cannot keep paying them, they are likely to ask for things like representation, they are likely to push for things like maybe further democracy, or at least like further representation of these groups and these interests in that area. That is clearly a threat to Qatar, a threat to Qatar not only in the sense that it's literally a threat to the leaders that lead the country, but also because that sort of power struggle would be detrimental to Qatar being able to do anything on an international stage, being able to have a cohesive oil industry or a cohesive tech or any other industry. And so it is incredibly important that we find jobs for these individuals. And notably, these are not individuals that are ever going to work in oil and construction. These are individuals who are used to having relatively white-collar, executive jobs that would go really neatly into the kinds of jobs that we tell you we bring to Qatar. Those are jobs surrounding law and administration and investment and all of that kind of stuff. And that means that it is incredibly important that we do this to kind of avoid that harm that Qatar, again, uniquely is facing, that other countries in this area don't have to worry about, and so they are likely to be able to outperform them on that area. But the final thing to say is that I just also don't think that this needs to be as necessarily harmful for oil and construction as they say it is. That is to say that there are policies that we can stand for, things like parental leave that do not impact these workers particularly badly because they tend to be, single individuals, young migrant workers, stuff like that. And that means that, a lot of the policies we back and stand behind are not ones that are going to undercut this industry at all. We think that even if it does, it is still beneficial, we still win this debate, but that the massive level of harms they talk about are unrealistic. Realistically, this looks like a transition away from it and an uplift in other areas as we implement these sort of reforms and policies. Don't believe what they say about how this just cripples the industry entirely. This is the way that we get the transition that both sides agree. Let's talk then about that transition, why we get it, why it is so important. And that's again for what we tell you at first, that is that the world currently is looking for an economic hub in the Middle East, in the Gulf region. As North Africa, as the Middle East and the Gulf becomes one of the fastest developing economic growth regions in the world, and as there are not economic hubs nearby, as other regions of the world become less powerful, we point you to examples first. As things like agglomeration means that it is incredibly important that these are concentrated in particular areas, that countries are benefited in particular areas. And we told you that other countries are looking for this. That Saudi Arabia is building cities to try and credit this, that the places are bidding for international sports matches, that people are industrializing and building airports and stuff like that. And the Qatar, if they do not do this, is likely to lose this battle, is likely not to. But then if Qatar does this, they are a prime candidate for winning this, they are a prime candidate for getting this benefit. And that's because they are willing to make the trade-offs that a country like Saudi Arabia never can, because they are in a place where they can trade off their oil industry. They are in a place where they can make concessions in that area if they need to attract these major industries. That is because they are a country that is already westernizing and reforming, that is including these things, that is on that pathway, that is able to get a better reputation. I think that means that this is the country that can do it, that if they bid for this, they are likely to get a significant number of these areas. Why then is it necessary to do this in all industries and across the country, rather than just what they claim in terms of industry specific? And this is very, very simple. It is that it is a reputational thing. You are never ever going to convince someone from the United States, someone from Australia, someone from the vast majority of Europe to move to a country that still does stuff like essentially enslave migrant workers. You're never going to convince these people to move when they are concerned that if they go there, their children are going to be exposed to those sort of things. You're never going to be able to move if they themselves are concerned that if they go there, things like their documentation will be taken away from you. That there aren't legal systems and tribunals that are set up to protect them. That there are not, places that are adequate for them to live. That they are going to have to be confronted with all of those kind of things. And I think that is particularly important in the context of the Qatar FIFA World Cup, where this reputation is backwards. It is one that needs remedying. Again, we bring you this imperative. It is one that needs bold action, because that is the way that we get people to move. Why then is this debate winning? Because I think it is. Because I think it is so much more debate winning, even if this has to be a trade-off between industries. And that is because we tell you this is long-term, this is significant. This looks like Qatar being a major international player. This looks like them comparing to, Singapore in the Southeast Asia region. This looks like them being able to have the basis of all major legal and consulting firms within their borders, and then being able to play off all the countries that rely on those kind of things, benefiting from being able to tax maybe to a marginal degree, because they've got relatively low tax rates, but tax to some degree these companies economies and benefit from them. Being able to do things like again, benefit from having expat workers who come and build skills in those areas, who invest in things, like whether that is education systems or technology or stuff like that, because they want to have good lives for their children when they move there and do that. We think that this leads to the sort of development that is long-term, that is sustainable, that is internationally important, that literally turns Qatar from a country that is struggling to compete in an oil battle that we tell you they are not winning, to a country that is winning in a technology battle, that is winning in a battle for things like financial services, that is winning in a legal battle. And that very, very, very clearly is in Qatar's interest. That is something that we should stand for. That is something that we should support. And something that I think they recognise they are supporting when they do, they recognise that this has to be done now. That is why they're investing in airports. That is why they're doing these reforms. Now is the time. We are the team that does that. So happy to propose.
If you believe what side affirmative tells you when they say that there is a substantial threat to the government being able to maintain its economic power, being able to continue to pay off the cushy jobs it affords its citizens in order to maintain its economic control, in order to maintain its legitimacy as a state, you must vote side negative. Because it is incredibly unclear throughout the entirety of that affirmative taking place. They want to jump straight to claiming that the benefits of investment, straight to getting those industries. It is incredibly unclear if this risk is already occurring to governments, why it is that they have enough spare capital to maintain both things, to keep paying off their citizens and invest currently, when you are also undergoing the massive change of now affording a higher minimum wage to all your citizens, of now making sure your industries are actually safe, of now making sure you take on all those barriers to making sure people have labor rights. That is expensive. That is the thing that knifes your capacity to actually invest your economy into a way that can guarantee your safety in the long term. I'm going to deal firstly with the short-term impact acts of this. Side affirmative tells you that Qatar is already uncompetitive on oil, already uncompetitive on construction, that this is not going to be a massive consequence. What do they tell you on oil? They tell you that they're uncompetitive because they just lack things like sufficient access to export networks. There's too many concessions on rights. I note that firstly, if you I think it is incredibly clear for the reasons that we tell you that the concessions have not happened across all areas, that it would have been incredibly expensive, that currently they are able to benefit from exploiting this labor, that they do get incredibly cheap conditions there. But I know that if you believe what they say about that these concessions on rights have happened, there is clearly no delta in this debate. It is unclear why you want even stronger nights there. Secondly, they tell you that you're uncompetitive for other reasons, such as say export networks. Again, incredibly unclear. Clearly, Qatar has been sold on oil previously, has access to things, is a part of OPEC, clearly has the similar access to the industries. Thirdly, they tell you it's a small country that is waning ability to maximize profit over time because of things like the climate countries, because it's a small country. I think this tells you uniquely, actually, why it is that there is the most dire need to maximize your profits now. Because if it is true that you cannot sell oil forever, if it is true that you are going to run out, that means that you need to maximize the profit of all the oil that you sell, right? You need to make sure your margins on every liter are as high as possible. You need to make sure you are keeping your labor costs down. You need to make sure you maintain the maximal ability to move to different areas, that you don't have to invest upfront, that you don't have to keep people safe, and therefore you can get the biggest amount of money while you still can. And if you believe that the oil industry is failing, that is the very reason and why you need to get as much money out of it while you still can in order to continue to finance it. Secondly, on construction, they tell you that they've the majority finished up their construction projects, and therefore it uniquely does not matter. I think this is in tension with all the material that they give you about how important it is to access new business ventures, access new tourist hubs. Because if you believe that we need to invest in those things, you must believe that that investment substantially takes the form of construction. You need to build the new tourist hubs for people to go to begin with. You need to build the new offices for people to work in. You need to invest money into upgrading your economy through things like building higher value added industries, through establishing stronger IT networks, through doing the things that allow you to garner investment. Those are still things you need to pay for. It is unclear where they get the money for it when you've knifed your ability to profit from one of your biggest industries. But additionally, even if you believe that they have some ability to invest in those things, obviously that money goes substantially less far when you now have to pay your workers way more, when you have to make sure that they are safe. If that is how they unlock their benefit, we are able to get it better under our side, so we can actually deliver it in the first instance. Why must you weigh the short-term loss of money incredibly highly in this debate? Firstly, you just lose your ability to placate your population to the same extent, to placate your citizens, and both teams agree that Qatar substantially justifies its rule through its ability to grant concessions to its citizens, to give the small proportion of the population that are its actual citizens, noting that the workforces that they exploit are primarily migrants that compose almost 90% of the jobs in their economy overall. They try and tell you that now you're easing the burden because you can get them new jobs. We tell you that you cannot get new jobs or new investment without the prerequisite of being able to profit from incredibly cheap labor. Secondly, I think you just lose control of your internal governing structures. Noting what we tell you about the fact that Qatar is autocratic, is controlled primarily by a series of oligarchs, with people with key financial interests, at the point where these people are no longer as satisfied, where they are no longer profiting themselves, that is when you get the greatest amounts of dissent within the internal governing structures. That leads to things like fissures. When you are otherwise placating yourselves through money and that money starts to dry up, that is when you get the most instability as a state overall. But thirdly, I would note this is probably just a massive chilling effect on any ability to access other forms of investment. This is particularly important given we now tell you that it is harder to invest internally because you no longer have massive current account balances that allow you to reinvest. I think this is a terrible signaling effect. They want to tell you, Western businesses, international businesses care most about human rights, care most about imaging. Incredibly unclear that this is the case. I note firstly, transnational corporations have incredibly massive amounts of power over the countries that they do business with. They exist in incredibly asymmetric power dynamic. They want to go to the countries where they are able to exploit the labor the most, that is able to give them the greatest amount of tax concessions, that is able to aid their upfront investment the most. You have the greatest ability to do these things when you maintain your current account balances. But secondly, it's just unclear that these transnational corporations care. It is unclear that any immediate pressure to the extent that it exists is sufficient. Their second and maybe slightly better push here is to suggest that individuals no longer want to move or to work in these industries because they don't have the highest skilled workers that you maybe do want, and the management you do want you simply cannot get. Few problems with this. Firstly, as we note to you from first, it is incredibly easy to do things like just grant selective protections to those industries. People in privileged, high-paying jobs will always be protected no matter what. Clearly, they are the ones with the greatest amounts of bargaining power. Clearly, they maintain that under our side as well. Clearly, you still want to work there. Secondly, I'll note these people just have a clear financial interest. People move to different countries that they don't agree with the politics of to get money all the time. Look at Dubai. You still want to earn the most amount of money. It's unclear that this is the tipping point that forces you to not want to work in those industries. But I'll note thirdly, it is just unclear that people care about treatment of things like migrant workers so much that this is ever going to be the tipping point. Noting that firstly, this is common across a variety of countries if you are choosing to work internationally. But secondly, it's just true of most countries internationally. Are you telling me that in Australia, in America, we treat our migrant workers well? That all our rights are always protected? That that you don't have a massive amount of exploitative contracts. If you believe that investment is the path to security for this economy, that allows stability, you necessarily must believe the best way to maintain that investment is not to make radical change at that tipping point. It is to keep the most amount of money for investment. It is to preserve your ability to give concessions, to draw in new companies to invest in you, to make sure you improve your economy over time. For those reasons, so proud to negate.
My dad worked in the oil industry when I was quite a bit younger, in fact before I was born. And when my parents were very young and trying very hard to get pregnant with me, and unfortunately finding it very difficult to do so, they made the decision to move temporarily to Dubai. They thought that they might be there for 2 or 3 years, and they were intending to work in the oil industry there. Well, my dad was, and my mom was going to be kind of a stay-at-home parent, I guess, or maybe find some work there. And ultimately what ended up happening, as things like this often do, is shortly after they made that commitment and moved to Dubai, my mom found out that she actually was pregnant with me. At that point, my parents decided immediately they had to get out of the country as soon as they could. They stayed for about 6 months, and then they left, and they actually moved to Australia for a little bit before ultimately moving back to Canada. And the reason that my parents made that decision, and that any sort of person with any sort of power would make the decision to never stay in one of these countries to work for longer than a year or 2, is because without legal backing of your rights and certainty, Westerners in particular find it very scary to live in a country where in theory the rights of the children that they might want to have in that country, or their rights, or maybe the rights of the secondary spouse who is working in industries that may not be like being being an exec at McKinsey, but might be more low level, like being a teacher or a healthcare worker or something similar, as my mom was, like a healthcare worker. Those families and those young people do not stay long enough to set up the kinds of offices that we desperately need to create in Qatar. That is the fundamental problem in the tipping point that this team ignores and fails to deal with. Let's talk about the imperative in this debate. We explained that there is a deadlock in the competition that is happening in the Gulf right now. Saudi Arabia is probably the wealthiest country in this area, but it is also the most repressive and the most unstable. It is the closest to Yemen. It engages in conflict. Tell you that other countries like the UAE tend to be more socially conservative, that Bahrain and Oman are just not developed enough to really kind of attract this investment. Qatar actually has the momentum and the advantage in this moment right this second. It has things like a strong international reputation through things like Al Jazeera and other outreach, through things like its success with FIFA. It has already constructed the resorts and the roads and the stadiums and the airport. Doha Hamad International just won the award for best airport in the world last year. If anybody here flew through there when they went to Madrid, they probably saw it advertised at them pretty fucking relentlessly. And that is why it is not correct for this team to stress that you should wait for 5 more years, and then seemingly to concede that they would do all the same things that we want to do now. Because if you wait for 5 years, Saudi Arabia will have already done it. They will have already gotten McKinsey and Deutsche Bank and other big multinationals to set up and commit to building new head offices in Riyadh instead of doing it in Qatar. And that is a fundamental problem for this team. We explained to you in Tetsushi's speech that the imperative here is to win the race, to be the next financial hub, to be the Singapore of the Middle East. And there is, interestingly, only one Singapore in Southeast Asia, because of the explanation we give you, again in Tetsushi's speech, around how economic agglomeration means that usually offices tend to congregate because that's where the workforce is and that's where they have the most industrial power, that's where they can get the best forms of regulation. And this particular legal change is one that attracts that investment and locks it in for those 5 to 10 year timelines that it takes for those Western executives to create new offices from scratch. On this side, you would not be able to do it. They run into the problem that we described, where the revenue from oil is not going up, it is slowly going down, but the needs of the Qatari population, the size of the Qatari population, and the demands of that population for strong and stable jobs, for economic growth, for the belief that their children will have better lives than they do, are only growing. They cannot sustain it, and they must take the plunge on this side immediately. Let's talk about then social order in Qatar. Because interestingly, this debate really is not at all about economic growth, it's actually just about economic transition. And the problem here is, we explained to you again in Tetsushi's speech, to no response. There's a fundamental social understanding in these Gulf countries where people are denied political representation But in exchange, they also do not pay taxes, and in exchange, they know that they can rely on the government to give them things like basically guaranteed jobs for citizens that pay them very well and that are reliable and stable. And that is a bargain that has existed for the past 20 to 30 years to great success in these Gulf countries. It is quite a unique arrangement, but it was never going to be sustainable because it relied on the money that was made through the oil industry. Right now, Qatar does have the financial reserves to have embarked on the massive construction project it has completed. It has the financial reserves to temporarily lift the conditions for those workers and to pay them for things that are often long-term protections and rights that take a while to accrue and activate. Things that we described to you. Paid parental leave, creating a tribunal that workers can sue their employers in easily. That type, long service leave, sick leave, all of these are things that are not actually immediate costs because they tend to accrue, but they're an immediate commitment. And that is what attracts the investment that we described. Because the issue in this debate is not about getting more investment or more growth. It is actually about finding other firms that can take these Qataris who are working these government jobs, honestly as a form of social welfare in many instances, off of your hands and provide them with that wealth and that employment instead. It is easy for a government worker to move from a public service department into a consulting firm or a financial firm or another kind of policy wonk services firm. Those skills are usually very transferable. This is the only way that you can rid yourself of the burden of these Qatari citizens who have grown used to this arrangement, but also are beginning to sense that it is unsustainable and unstable and increasingly becoming anxious about what will happen for them when the oil runs out, or when it is no longer economically viable. This team, by continuing to wait, further increases the risk of domestic political instability, increases the risk that these workers no longer take the bargain of no taxation and no representation, and begin to instead demand representation and control over a government that they're likely to see as unreliable, stagnant, and not forward-looking. On this team's side, where they continue to wait, and when they see the changes and the investments being made in places like Riyadh, by building things like NEOM and other major innovations that are happening all around them in this region, but on their side, their government would just neglect. Which is why, in fact, we give people certainty of their rights. We create the unique conditions that mean that these Western companies will set up these services firms, and will be able to do this for you. That is what means that Qatar will be an economic powerhouse, not just for the next 3 to 5 years on their side, but into the next 50 years on our side. That locks in the current regime as well, means that you have guaranteed stability. So I think that we are winning pretty clearly on that issue. Let's then weigh that off over the main contribution that we get from side negative in this debate, and that is about oil and construction workers. They are quite nuanced here. They just kind of rely on the idea that we're increasing the wage. But the problem is that in the oil sector in particular, the wages are already high. They're also not paid by the Qatari government like they're paid by private industries. So that's kind of a strange claim for them to make. But also, the reforms that we're talking about usually aren't around wage because those workers are quite highly paid already. They are actually just around things like rights and entitlements. The second thing to say, though, is that while we would acknowledge, obviously, that this does look like a significant lift in the wage and conditions of, say, a construction worker, this team just relies on intuition pumping, that construction is not complete. But they can't actually explain to you what needs to be constructed. The resorts are already there. The office blocks are already there. The problem is that right now they're being occupied by bloated government departments. We would sell those things as we downscale and give them instead to these private firms. You don't need to build new offices. If you've flown over Qatar, you'll notice that it is extremely highly developed already. What is important here then is to recognize that we are further along the timeline than side negative themselves describe than they are willing to admit. It is not the time to continue to construct. It is not the time to hope that declining oil revenues will service an ever-growing and ever more demanding population. You must make this decision now, or you get left in the dust by Saudi Arabia forever. For that reason, extremely proud to affirm.
problem with this opposition is that it's simply untrue that Qatar is done building, because they've been focusing on a stadium for the last decade. A resort is not a city, and in order for opposition to claim they're white-collar like workers and have the industry come in, they must in fact have those office buildings built, which could only happen under our side because we're the ones that provide a transition. Of the 3 million people in Qatar, 300,000 are citizens. The rest are the migrant workers that actually support the foundations of that economy, support the foundations of that country, and that is why we're ahead in this debate. Opposition has to guarantee rights for everyone in that country. Perhaps we could guarantee rights for perhaps Western expats if we wanted to. We would note that what opposition sacrifices all the potential construction and oil benefits we carry down. Two questions I'm going to answer in this speech. First, how does this affect the economy now? And secondly, how does it affect them in the future? We're going to talk about the long game. Firstly, how does this affect the economy now? And this explains why the most immediate harm in this debate and the most likely harm is the ones that you must care about. Because citizens in Qatar only make up 10%. The rest of their economy, all the money they get, and in fact, those citizens are often the middle managers, or just people below them. If there are no people who want to work under them anymore, that simply means that the citizens of Qatar cannot make the money that they are currently, which means that it's clearly not in their interest. The big claim that we get from opposition is that you need these Western businesses to come in. That is reliant on two premises. First premise that it's reliant on is that Western companies won't come in under our side and will exclusively come in under theirs. There are 4 problems with this premise and it's underproven. The first is to say that it's unclear that the businesses care about the labour standards in the country so far as they can just uphold the standards themselves. It's unlikely that Google starts like a new office in Qatar and then proceeds to just drop their labour standards all the way to the bottom. It's unclear why that's something that's particularly important. But the second thing is that it's unclear that people care that much about the company's reputation. I would say that probably almost anyone here has bought stuff from fast fashion. Places don't have particularly good labour standards, but they buy it anyway. And especially in white-collar jobs, it's unlikely that you differentiate between the different officers which are perhaps servicing you. And so therefore, it's unclear why this is a particularly reputational harm that means you wouldn't start it up in this area anyway. The third problem with this argument is that if we're talking about white-collar workers, there is no comparative advantage of being in Qatar over being in these other countries at all. And we would say that you don't have the capacity to give them the sorts of tax rates which we could under our side, where we have like a functioning economy at that point, and that allows us to have the transition. But the final thing that we'd say here is that if you do want those other companies to come in, one of the ways of doing that would just be have the lowest standards we have under our side, because that incentivizes people to come in through things like manufacturing, which are also other industries that these opposition sacrifices under their law. With that in mind, the first premise of this argument is gone. Even if you don't believe that, the second premise this opposition would need to prove is that the benefit actually goes to Qatar itself. There are 2 problems with this premise. The first problem is that it's unclear that the Western company actually directly benefits Qatar. What they push under their side is that, well, they're incredibly low tax. I would posit that if they're incredibly low tax, the benefit to Qatar is actually probably very small. They have not explained why they wouldn't just hire overseas people, which is probably most likely for the reason that we would just point out that they probably just know the systems that the company works under. Like if you worked in Silicon Valley under Google, it's probably easiest to just move you from that office to the office in Qatar. It's unclear why you would hire Qataris who don't have that sort of experience, and therefore there's no reason why you would gain that benefit, or even if the company starts, why there would be a big benefit to Qatar itself. But the second thing that we'd say is that the companies are often risk averse, which means that unlikely you will just start up in a new place and then just take a whole new set of people. It's more likely you just take the people you're already hiring and then just move them across, which means that even if you believe that Western companies do move to this opposition, the problem is that they haven't explained why that benefit actually goes to Qatar in the first place. What does that mean for this debate? It means that the biggest argument of this opposition, which is that some Western companies may come in, does not have a benefit to Qatar in this debate, and is simply not in their interest. With that in mind, the second sort of thing we point out is the huge amount of damage that this does to oil. And I note that we get 2 responses down the bench. The first thing that they say is that the oil industry is dying, which we point out is simply untrue for some set of time into the future, which means that for the up to 50% of the Qatari population which works in the oil industry, that is a devastating harm, and especially to Qatari citizens. And I'll note the oligarchs, who are the ones who run the oil industry, that is particularly harmful because their industry simply cannot function. We point out the fact that you can't do things like raise labor costs because you're in that competition, but secondly, because it's difficult to mechanize, and thirdly, that you have to provide safety measures which are incredibly expensive. All of that explains why, under opposition side, the biggest industries in Qatar simply cannot function. And what that means is that in opposition's best case, where they explain there is a small benefit of some Western companies come in, it simply does not stack up to what we tell you happens into the future, happens into the next 10 or 20 years. And the fact that you actually need these people in order for the white collar workers and the technology industry, they say, to operate, because you need to build the buildings for them to be in. You need them to build the city. A resort is not a city, and just because they happen to now have a stadium doesn't explain why, why you don't also need them for that transition period. With that in mind, second question I'm then going to ask is what happens in the long term for the economy? And I know that this is less important than the first thing that I've explained, because if you believe that the short term is so bad for Qatar, the problem is that they don't have resources in the long term, which means that even though they may have an idealistic plan, that plan will never go to action for the reason that we pointed out that in the short term, there'll be such a devastating failure that you can't get to the point where you make that transition. We would point out first, their big claim here that you don't, the first thing that we point out here, that you don't have enough money to diversify yet. They obviously say the opposite. Three problems with this. First thing that we'd say is that they've just experienced a crisis through COVID, and oil prices have only just recovered with the invasion of Ukraine, which necessarily means that they're not in the position right now to try and do the diversification which opposition tries to have. But the second thing that we'd point out is that Western companies haven't moved in yet, so you still need to offer tax breaks, but you can't do that because you don't have the requisite amount of resources to do so, because you don't have the money that we would have under our side. The final thing that we'd say is that you must compete with places like Dubai and Saudi Arabia, thus meaning that you need the continued investment, and therefore you need the economic position that we provide under opposition, and they simply do not provide under theirs. Their final line, the second claim here is sort of they overstate the problems with the labor laws in Qatar. I would note a couple of things. First thing to say that you can just, even if there's some reputational harm, we would say that you can just blame it on being a natural death as Qatar's done. And we would say that it's unclear why this is particularly helpful. But the second thing that we'd say is that countries currently buy from Qatar anyway, because because their oil is simply so cheap. And their claim about oil being uncompetitive in the case of Qatar, is problematic for the reason that you don't need to be the most competitive all the time, because there is in fact undersupply of oil in many cases, which means that Qatar can still sell. They sell to countries like Japan or South Korea, and importantly, a lot of countries who don't care about human rights, like in the case of China, who continues to buy from Qatar anyway, and they care more about the price. The final thing that we'd say is that if other countries try and pressure Qatar in the way that this opposition sort of insinuates by sort of saying that it's harmful to their global standing and reputation, we would say that that's not particularly a problem for Qatar, for the reason that Qatar has huge leverage, sort of bodies like OPEC, or just organizations which have a lot of oil, which means they're able to avoid the worst sort of consequences this opposition talks about. So, what do you know at the end of this question, in terms of the long term, is that even if you buy the opposition has some sort of long-term plan, it can never come into fruition because you would require the resources and the success of the short term that we talk about, because the fact that 50% of the Qatari population or the people in Qatar do work in the oil industry, that this opposition totally crumbles. At the end of this speech, our side is the only one that helps them right now. A resort is not a city. You need our funds to transition, and that's why we win the debate.